It starts almost invisibly, doesn't it? A few glances at a phone during dinner. A bedroom door closed just a bit longer. The dim glow of a screen late at night. The silent tap of thumbs swiping and scrolling, searching for something that never quite appears. If you're a parent, a teacher, an older sibling, or simply someone paying attention, you've probably seen it. The restless energy, the tightening in the chest, the deep sighs that come not from physical exhaustion but from something harder to name. And if you've ever been young, and of course you have, you might remember your own version of it too. Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation isn't a book that shouts. Instead, it sits you down quietly, looks you in the eye and asks, do you see what's happening? Really see it, not as a passing headline about kids these days or as another moral panic, but as a real, measurable and heartbreakingly human crisis that has unfolded almost silently over the past decade. It's a book that blends data, psychology, cultural history and plain-spoken empathy. And though it is full of charts and studies, its real weight comes from the simple human truth at its center. Something in the fabric of childhood and adolescence has changed, and the cost is anxiety, depression, loneliness, and a generation increasingly unsure how to live in its own skin. Haidt, a social psychologist known for his work on moral psychology and cultural division, comes to this topic not as a crusader but as someone piecing together a puzzle. He sees the same pattern appearing across countries, across income levels, across cultures. Sometime between roughly 2010 and 2015, the mental health of teenagers, especially teenage girls, started to collapse. Rates of self-harm, hospitalization for suicidal thoughts, anxiety diagnoses, and depression began to surge, and they have not returned to pre-2010 levels since. The crisis is real. It's not explained away by better reporting or greater openness. And it is specific to the smartphone generation, the first wave of kids to enter adolescence with Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and a smartphone in their pockets at all times. Reading this, it's impossible not to think of someone you know. Maybe a niece who no longer wants to go to sleepovers. A neighbor's son who dropped out of soccer because he just wasn't feeling up to it. Or maybe it's your own childhood memories, colliding painfully with the present. A time when boredom meant wandering the neighborhood, not scrolling endlessly, comparing your life to curated images of everyone else's. Haidt calls what happened a great rewiring of childhood. The phrase is haunting because it suggests something both technical and organic. A sudden change in the way brains and lives develop, caused not by a single villain but by a perfect storm of new technology, cultural shifts and unintended consequences. Childhood shifted from a largely physical, social, play-based experience into one that is increasingly solitary, digital, and mediated by screens. And yet, this isn't a book of nostalgia. Haidt isn't arguing that modern life is bad and the past was perfect. He acknowledges the real dangers of earlier eras: violence, discrimination, exclusion, and he doesn't long for a mythical golden age. Instead, what he mourns is the quiet disappearance of something psychologists know is essential for healthy development: unsupervised real-world play and socialization. In the decades before smartphones, kids learned resilience not because they were taught it in a class but because they lived it. Negotiating playground conflicts, biking across town, building forts, making mistakes and recovering from them. This wasn't always pretty and it certainly wasn't always safe, but it taught something screens cannot. It taught how to read faces, sense danger, manage embarrassment, and build real, durable confidence from small acts of courage. When childhood became screen-based, these small, daily formative challenges began to vanish. Haidt is at his most compelling when he explains why this shift has been especially hard on adolescents, and particularly on girls. He describes how the teenage brain is wired to seek social approval and belonging, to experiment with identity, and to build emotional resilience through real relationships. Social media platforms designed to maximize engagement exploit these very traits. Likes and comments become measures of worth. Photos become performances rather than memories. For boys, the crisis shows up too, but often as withdrawal into gaming, porn, or online echo chambers rather than the visible, self-referential anxiety and depression more common among girls. And while it's tempting to say, it's just social media, Haidt argues the problem is broader. It's the whole ecosystem of a phone-based childhood. Kids sleep less because phones stay by their beds. They go outside less because screens are easier and safer than the unpredictability of real-world play. They spend less time face-to-face, so they lose the daily practice of reading emotions, negotiating conflicts, and recovering from awkwardness. The phone isn't just an object. It becomes the medium through which childhood itself is lived, and that, he shows, is the real danger. One of the most unsettling parts of the book is Haidt's discussion of anti-fragility, a term borrowed from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, describing systems that don't just survive stress but need it to grow stronger. Children, Haidt writes, are anti-fragile. They need to face manageable risks and occasional failures to develop courage, coping skills, and perspective. When we overprotect them from every hurt, disappointment, or conflict, we don't make them safer in the long run. We leave them more fragile. The irony, Haidt points out, is painful. As society became more safety-conscious in the physical world, it became recklessly unsafe in the digital world, handing kids devices whose effects were barely understood, and doing so at the exact moment when their brains were least prepared to manage them. Yet the anxious generation isn't only diagnosis. It's also an argument for change. Haidt makes 4 main recommendations, each deceptively simple yet culturally profound. Delay giving kids smartphones and social media until at least age 16. Increase real-world, unsupervised play. Get phones out of schools. And teach digital literacy as part of civic education. These ideas sound radical only because we've become so used to a culture where children's lives are constantly mediated by screens. In truth, they're grounded in developmental science and common sense. Reading these suggestions, I found myself torn between hope and skepticism. The hope comes from the clarity of the vision. A childhood more grounded in reality, friendship, and embodied experience. The skepticism comes from knowing how enormous the cultural and economic forces against change truly are. Tech companies whose business depends on youth engagement, parents who fear exclusion for their kids, and schools caught between educational ideals and the practical pressure to keep kids online. And yet, Haidt insists change is possible, and points to places where it's already beginning. Some schools have gone phone-free, reporting fewer fights and better focus. Some parents, by organizing together, have delayed smartphones for whole cohorts of kids, making it easier for everyone. Haidt isn't naive about the scale of the problem, but he refuses to see it as inevitable. His message, ultimately, is that we do have agency, and it must be collective because no single parent or child can resist the pull of a culture built to keep them scrolling. What makes this book so quietly devastating isn't only the data or the policy failures. It's the small human moments Haidt describes. A middle school girl checking her likes before getting out of bed. A teenager who can't remember the last time he played outside without an adult watching. A family dinner where everyone is together, yet everyone is alone behind glass. These moments remind us that anxiety isn't abstract. It's lived daily, in small gestures, in stolen sleep, in the growing sense among young people that the world is not only stressful but somehow empty of meaning. And yet, what lingers after finishing The Anxious Generation isn't despair but a quiet resolve. Because what Haidt ultimately argues is deeply hopeful. That children don't need perfection, they need presence. They don't need a world without pain, they need the tools to face it. And they don't need to be constantly connected online, they need to be deeply connected in real life. To friends, to family, to place, and to purpose. The real crisis, Haidt suggests, isn't technology itself but disconnection. From our bodies, our communities, and our sense of agency. And the real task isn't simply to take away screens, but to rebuild what screens replaced. Real play, real risk, real relationships, and the slow, sometimes messy work of growing up in the real world. As I closed the book, I thought of something small but telling. The difference between scrolling and strolling. Scrolling is frictionless, infinite, and isolating. Strolling, whether through a neighborhood, a park, or a friend's house, is limited, unpredictable, and shared. One consumes attention, the other cultivates it. And maybe, at heart, Haidt's plea is for more strolling and less scrolling, for childhoods made of grass stains and eye contact, not just filters and feeds. The Anxious Generation is, in the end, both a diagnosis and an invitation. It asks us not just to see what has changed but to ask, together, what kind of childhood, and what kind of adulthood, we want to build. And if that question feels overwhelming, perhaps that's exactly where real change begins. Not in easy answers but in the shared, deeply human realization that we cannot keep going as we have, and that the next generation deserves better. And maybe, just maybe, so do we.